Well, Shabbat Shalom again, everybody. Good to see you all. Well, I'm not seeing the people on YouTube or Rumble, but I'm seeing the people here on our Zoom meeting. So today is the first High Holy Day of the Feast of Unleavened Bread, 2024. Last night we celebrated Pesach or Passover. And so I'm kind of continuing where I left off in the previous discussion, where we talked about some of the important aspects of Passover. And I want to talk, I brought up in the previous discussion about how the Sabbath and the biblical feasts are like rails that keep us on the path that leads us to Yehovah, ultimately to our Father in heaven and to eternal life. I don't know about you, in your own personal experience, some of you watching this may relate to what I'm talking about, but I'm in my mid-60s, and I've been celebrating and observing the biblical feasts almost my entire life, since I was a baby. I was born into it. And my family's been doing this since the early 1950s. So now it's like 75 years or so, and or almost 75 years that they have been doing this. And I have seen a lot of water go under the bridge, and I have seen I've been in a few churches that observe the biblical feasts and the Sabbath, and I've known a lot of people. And I will tell you that the people that begin to question the Sabbath or begin to not guard or keep the Sabbath, and as well as the feast days. And I saw this too when I was pastoring a local congregation for 18 years and teaching Torah. When people began to compromise on the Sabbath and the biblical feasts, everything else in their life began to fall apart. It was a slippery slope. You maybe heard me say this before, but the Jews have a saying. It's not so much that the Jews keep the Sabbath or have kept the Sabbath, it's that the Sabbath has kept the Jews. Having that weekly cycle, that weekly reminder, that weekly ritual of keeping the Sabbath has kept religious Jews, at least, intact as a community. And those that stop doing that, they frither away into secularism and into whatever and lose their faith. And the same is true. The same is true with people that started out or at some point in time began to do the Sabbath and the feasts, and they begin to compromise those things. Oh, my job, or my family, or it's just too much work, or they make other excuses. Well, we can't keep the feast outside the land of Israel, any other kind of, or other nonsense like that. And before you know it, after a few years, they are off doing this or off doing that, and not even walking in the faith, or things start to come against them. They start to have health issues. They start to have marriage problems. And their lives start to fall apart. And I'm not saying that keeping the Sabbath and the feast days is going to be a guarantee that everything in your life is going to go all right. No, that's not what I'm saying here. I'm just saying that it's more likely that will keep you on the right path and in the river of life, or like a train on the rails, heading in the right direction. Because these rituals and these ceremonies and these remembrances of past, present, and future events, and these steps in the plan of Yehovah's salvation, of which the biblical feasts and the Sabbath too are steps in that. They keep bringing us back to and helping to remind us of these steps, and they help to renew our faith and get us all excited again when we come together and meet and celebrate and share our testimonies and share our faith and reinforce one another and encourage and edify and build up one another and And every year we get new insights and new understandings into these things, and it helps bring us closer to Yeshua and to our Father in heaven, and keeps our faith strong and burning alive. That's why nations have holidays, because it helps them to remember historical events so they can appreciate their history. That's why many times people celebrate birthdays or anniversaries or whatever, because it helps them to remember when they were born, or how special that was, or an anniversary, or other maybe family reunions that people do things once a year, because it helps to bring families together. It's about togetherness. It's about love. It's about remembering. It's our culture. It's who we are. We need these things. We need to stop our daily routines every once in a while and focus on the bigger and the more important things in life. We all need a higher purpose in life. A higher purpose. Patriotism in a country is a higher purpose. That's why people go off to defend their country and are willing to die in battle to defend their country. That's why there is celebrations, because we feel proud of being in our country and being part of the culture. And it's a glue that holds us together and keeps the country together. And same thing with family traditions. Helps hold the family together. And there's the same thing in Yehovah's kingdom. He has things that help hold us together. Otherwise, we'll just kind of fall apart and forget who we are and forget where we're going. I want to talk about the rails of our faith. They keep us pointed in the right direction and on the track towards salvation and eternal rewards. I'm talking about the biblical feasts, the Torah, the Sabbath. They help to keep our faith strong and our focus straight ahead, so we don't get distracted by this or that will pull us aside into this or that. Christianity tends to promote keeping one's eyes on Yeshua, on Jesus. But in practical terms, what does that actually mean? Do we keep our eyes only on a person or a personality? Or is it more than that? What he taught and how he lived and what he represented and who he was. It is one thing to keep your focus on Yeshua or Jesus, which is a good thing. But it's another totally different thing, and it's at a higher level, to obey what he taught, his commandments, to do what he did, to follow his example of what he did, which tell us how to love him. His commandments tell us how to love him and our fellow man. He said, if you love me, keep my commandments. Don't just talk about me. Do what I did. As far as lifestyle. At an even higher level, it's a whole other thing to keep his Sabbaths, which are part of his commandments. All of these things combined keep us on the track that leads into his kingdom. And never forget, these are the means to an end, not the end in itself. They are the way to the Father in heaven, to Elohim, to a glorified existence in Yehovah's eternal kingdom as his glorified sons and daughters. And as I've said many times, if we stay on that track and we stay obedient to Yeshua and follow his commandments and do what he said to do, and our names are written in the Lamb's book of life, and we get to the end of our life, and we attain to the first resurrection, then we will be adopted into his family, and eventually our habitation will be the new heavens, the new earth, and the new Jerusalem. And in that spiritual dimension, you will not need the Torah anymore, because it's not a physical dimension, it's a spiritual dimension. You're not going to be married. You're not going to have a sun and moon, so you can't do the Sabbaths and the feasts. You don't have to worry about having sex outside of marriage, because you're not going to be married, and you're going to have a spiritual body, and you're not going to be involved in procreation. You're not going to need to eat, so you don't need to worry about the dietary laws. And I can go on and on and on, because you're a spirit being. You're going to be doing things much better than eating, trust me. You're going to be doing much better things than having sex with your wife. I mean, that as wonderful as that may be, you're going to be doing things, I don't even know what, but it's going to be so much better. Yehovah's Sabbaths are a visible sign. The Hebrew word is ot, O-T-H, a visible sign. If you look up the word ot in Hebrew and how it's used in the Bible, it's always something you can see. And it's forever. It's a sign between Yehovah and his people. Exodus 31:13 and verse 17, as well as Ezekiel 20, verse 12 and 20. Verses 12 and 20 of Ezekiel 20. The early church fathers went off the rails and veered into many unbiblical directions, which they passed on down. And this is where I'm going with this. As I said, when we get away from the Sabbaths, the biblical dietary laws, and the feasts, we start to go down an aberrant, errant path. I'm not saying everything they taught was bad, no. But it is a path in the wrong direction nonetheless. And when people begin to come back to the Hebraic roots, back to the biblical roots of their faith, they come back by the same way that the early church fathers left. They come back to the Sabbath, they come back to the feasts, and they come back to the dietary laws. And I am going to show you from the writings of the early church fathers how this happened, for in their own words. Yes, this was prophesied. The early church fathers went off the rails and veered into many unbiblical directions, which they passed on down. As Jeremiah prophesied, and this is not just the early church fathers, but this happened to many of the Israelite leaders along the way in the Bible. It says, our fathers have inherited lies, Jeremiah 16:19. And we're going to talk about some of those lies. And then in Hosea 4:6, it says, my people are destroyed for lack of knowledge. You hear this verse quoted all the time. Oh, he's destroyed for lack of knowledge. But they don't read the second half of the verse. Don't you love it when people pluck things out of context, especially Bible teachers, and they take something out of context and they don't even read the second half of the verse? My people are destroyed for lack of knowledge because they have rejected the Torah. Yehovah will reject them. Hosea 4:6. The Torah is what determines the truth. Not the Pope, not some bishop or cardinal or pastor or reverend or denomination or Bible college or whatever, or pastor. No, the Bible. Hosea 8 verse 12 says, the people have forgotten the Torah and considered it a strange thing. Hosea 8:12. And Hosea 8 verse 1 says, set the trumpet to the mouth. Why? Because Yehovah's people have rebelled against the Torah, against the law. Oh, you don't hear those verses quoted in your Sunday churches. No. Oh, no, no, no. Because if they do, people are going to be asking themselves the question, why are we going to church on Sunday and not on the seventh day, the Sabbath, which is the command in the Bible? And the example of the Creator in Genesis 2, verse 1. Oh no, they don't read those verses. They're too self-incriminating. Well, here we teach the whole truth and nothing but the truth. We don't just cherry pick out the things that are ear tickling and that if we preach, it will bring in the money. Follow the money. Keep the hirelings going in their little cushy positions. Hosea 6 verse 1. Come, let us return to Jehovah. He's talking about the Jews and the Christians. Go read the last verse of the previous chapter. Actually, the last several verses. Come, let us return to Jehovah, for he has torn, but he will heal us. He has stricken, but he will bind us. After 2 days or 2,000 years, he will revive us. Spiritual revival. On the third day, he will raise us up. That means he will resurrect the saints at Yeshua's coming in the third millennia after the birth of Yeshua. Oh, yes. We are in that third millennia, the 21st century. In the third day after Yeshua came in the first millennia, then we had the second millennia. Actually, we're in the second one. He was born in the third millennia, he was born at the end of the fourth millennia, like 3 BC. And then we've had 2,000 years since then. We are now in the third millennia, the 21st century. Okay? And actually, we're beginning the third millennia. So you can look at it a couple different ways. And, the year 2000 began the third millennia. Yeah, that's what I said the first time was true. So it says in the third day, or I believe the third millennia, he will raise us up. What else could this mean? He will revive us. He's waking us up to our spiritual roots, our Hebraic roots. He's, as Malachi says, before that great and terrible, dreadful day of Yehovah that will burn like a fire, and the ashes, there will be ashes under the wicked will be ashes under the soles of the feet of the righteous. He will turn the hearts of the children back to the fathers. That he will raise up the spirit of Elijah or John the Baptist. That's the John the Baptist message, to repent, for the kingdom of heaven is at hand. And John the Baptist came to prepare the way for the first Messiah's first coming, and Yeshua and Malachi says that there's going to be a second one, or a spirit of Elijah that's going to go forth. And we're part of that, urging people to repent and to come back to him. So after 2 days, he will revive us, spiritual revival. And on the third day, and I believe that has to do with the proliferation and the promulgation and the teaching of Torah and returning to the Hebrew roots of our faith. And on the third day, he will raise us up. Again, that's raise us up out of the grave to meet Yeshua in the air at his second coming, that we may live in his sight. So Yeshua will be ruling on this earth for 1,000 years, and the saints will be living in his sight as glorified sons and daughters. They will be a kingdom of priests, as Revelation says. They will be the bride of Yeshua. So let us pursue the knowledge of Yehovah. His going forth is established as the morning. He will come to us like rain, like the latter rain and the former rain. O Ephraim, what shall I do to you? O Judah, what shall I do to you? For your faithfulness is like a morning cloud, like the early dew. It goes away. The Jews and the Christians have not been faithful. Oh, maybe a little bit, but not fully. Like the early dew, it goes away. Here today, gone tomorrow. And therefore I have hewn them down by the prophets, or cut them down. And we could go on and on. I mean, I could spend the rest of the day just talking about Hosea. So Yah is calling his people back to the ancient paths, the good paths of Torah. Jeremiah 6:19. And like I said, we are that Elijah generation. He's calling back. I will have more to say about that in a minute, or maybe the next time, but not right now. So right now, I want to talk about, give you some historical perspective that you probably haven't heard anywhere else. And I've updated my information. I've written and published about this, but I have not reviewed this in a while. So I am going to share with you how some of the early church fathers, when I say early, I'm talking about the earliest of them. I'm talking about in the early 2nd century. So just to give you some historical perspective, Yeshua died around 30 AD, okay? Give or take. We don't know the exact year. And the book of Acts happened right after that. Paul and Peter probably died around 60, between 62 and 65 AD. The temple was destroyed in 70 AD. So that was, about 40 years after the death of Yeshua and the death and resurrection. And John the Revelator, John the disciple, John the apostle, died probably, he was very elderly. He died probably in the 90s AD. And that's when at least part of the book of Revelation was written, and maybe John's gospel and John's epistles. And there were some early church fathers that were actual disciples of John. 2 in particular that were alive during the time of John. One was Polycarp, who was a good guy. He was one of the good guys. And then there was Ignatius, who was also a disciple of John. And they lived in the... Polycarp lived probably from about 65 AD on. We don't know. Nobody knows when he died. And then you have Ignatius, who... his years are somewhere around 30 AD to 107 AD. And some scholars put him, he maybe died a little bit later. And then you have Barnabas. It's not the Barnabas of the Bible. This is Barnabas, who was an Alexandrian Jew. He lived in Alexandria, Egypt. And he wrote apparently the Epistle of Barnabas. And he lived from about AD 70 to AD 132. So here we have some overlap. And I'm going to quote some of these guys. And then we have Justin Martyr, who died, or who lived about 110 to 165 AD, or somewhere in that time frame. So a little bit later. So some of these people lived, the earlier ones lived during the time of John the Baptist. And I don't know, we're looking back through history through a dark lens. But we don't know when he says that some of these, like Polycarp and Ignatius, were disciples of John. What did that really mean? I don't know. Does that mean that they hung out with John for a long period of time? Does it mean that they exchanged letters? Or they hung out for a brief period of time? Don't know. Remember, back in that day, communication was not like it is today. It took a lot of effort to travel from one place to another. People often didn't, if they traveled 30 miles from their home, that was a long distance. So anyway, I'm not sure what that really means, but let me just share with you some things where little by little, these early church fathers began to go off the rails of the Sabbath and the biblical feasts and some other things too, if we have time to get into that. So first of all, I'm going to quote the epistle of Mathetes to Diognetus, Diognetus. And this, I am quoting here, this is all from I have a 10-volume set of Hendrickson. This is called the Ante-Nicene Church Fathers, published by Hendrickson Publishers. You can buy this online. And this is volume 1, the Ante-Nicene Church Fathers. It's not anti, it's anti, A-N-T-E. It means before the Council of Nicaea. The Council of Nicaea was ended in 325 AD. So roughly we're talking about 225, 230 years after the death of the last apostle, John. And that's when Constantine the Great was the emperor, and that's when he finalized and made official and legalized the Sunday, Easter, and other things like that. And that if you were Jewish or showed any signs of Jewishness, you could be hunted down, you could be persecuted, killed, or banished from the empire. So up until that time, there was a lot of debate about, is the Sabbath, the seventh-day Sabbath, is that something we should follow, or should we follow Sunday, keep Sunday? And there was a debate about Easter, what became known as Easter versus Passover. That was the Quartodeciman controversy. There were a lot of things, a lot of influences going on. And we read these early church fathers, and they're part of that. Remember, the Roman Empire was influenced by Greek philosophy. So you have the philosophers of the Greeks, Plato, Socrates, Pythagoras, and these guys who their philosophies were very unbiblical in many respects, and so these had a lot of currency with and a lot of influence over a lot of people. And the early church fathers, who were almost all Gentiles, came from that background. And so it's, this is what we're dealing with. And there was a lot of persecution going on by the Jews against the early Christians. The persecution was horrific. And also then you had the Roman Empire that was persecuting the Jews. And the Christians, to them, looked like the Jews because they kept the Sabbath and they kept the feast days. They didn't eat pork. They kept kosher. And so to the Romans, the early Christians were just another sect of Judaism, and the Jews were a pain in the side to the Roman Empire. They cost them a lot of money because they had to keep putting down uprisings, and they killed a lot of the Jews that were always rebelling against their rule and their authority there in the land of Israel. And eventually that culminated with the destruction of the temple, where the Roman armies finally came in and defeated the Jews once and for all. But then there was a second Jewish revolt, the Bar Kokhba revolt of 132 to 135 AD, where the Romans had to spend a lot of money and effort to send armies and put down that revolt. So the Jews were a constant pain in the side, a thorn in the side of the Romans, and so the Romans just get rid of them all. Get rid of them. And so there was a lot of pressure upon the early church fathers not to look Jewish. And so I can understand logically why they began to move away from those things in the Bible that, in the eyes of the Romans, made them look Jewish, because it might be a death sentence. So I understand a little bit about what was going on, because I can read the history. But nonetheless, they began to go off the rails and get away. I'm going to read some quotes from them. So the first one, circa 130 AD, These are teachings against the Sabbath and the biblical feasts. From the epistle of Mathetes to Diognetus, chapter 4. Again, it's from this book. If you have these set of books on your shelf, you can go and you will see exactly where it's at. The author refers to the dietary laws, the Sabbath and biblical feast and new moons as, quote, superstitions that are, quote, utterly ridiculous and unworthy of notice, end quote. And then we have Barnabas, the Alexandrian Jew, who lived circa AD 70 to AD 132, and he wrote the Epistle of Barnabas. Again, this is not the Barnabas in the book of Acts, okay? This is another Barnabas, or Barnabas. Chapter 15 of that, he quotes, twisting Isaiah, where Yehovah declares, your new moons and your appointed feasts my soul hates. They are a trouble to me. I am weary of bearing them. Isaiah 1:14. And then Amos 5:21 quotes this as well. And Barnabas quotes this as a proof text that Yehovah hates his own feast that he gave to Israel, when in reality he was hating their pagan perversions of the feasts. So, how many of you have heard this Isaiah 1:14 quoted as in your Christian churches as proof that Yehovah hated his own feasts and did away with them, and they're not for us anymore? Raise your hands. How many of you have heard that before? Yeah, I've heard that too. And I went back and had to study that. And it was your new moons, your feasts, not my feasts. Because they were in apostasy. And they were mixing paganism with the feasts of Yehovah, just like the Israelites did at the golden calf. At the golden calf. Exodus 31 or 32. When Moses was up on Mount Sinai, it says that they built a golden calf and they rose up to play. They had a sexual orgy. And they declared, Moses or Aaron declared, this is a feast unto Yehovah. He used the name, the tetragrammaton, Yud-Vav, Yehovah. There is an example of mixture. They built a pagan calf, Bel, that came from, the part of the Canaanite religions, or also the Egyptians worshiped the calf, and they rose down, they took their clothes off, and they had a sexual orgy, which is exactly how the pagans worshiped their demon gods. And they called it a feast unto Yehovah. That is the mixture of paganism with putting the name, a label on it, and dressing it up to make it look good. And we see many examples of that down through Israel's long history, during the kings, and even in the time of the judges, we have some examples of that. And in Samuel, they were constantly mixing the holy with the profane. And we see that in the Catholic Church. I have been into a lot of Catholic churches around the world in many countries. And like Mexico, for example, they mix some of the rituals of the indigenous people with the Catholic rituals. They admit that. Christmas is a perfect example of that. So is Easter. That goes back to the Roman times, back to the early church. And they say, well, we're just trying to evangelize the lost, and we're taking some of their traditions and we're sanitizing it, and the Christmas tree or the whatever. the Easter bunny. No! That's called syncretism. That's called bringing in demonic, pagan, wicked rituals, often that have sexual overtones, and then bringing them into the Bible, or mixing them with maybe some truth of the Bible. In this case, the resurrection or the advent of Yeshua. So Barnabas here is twisting the scriptures and making them say something that they do not say, and then taking that which is holy and saying Yah hates it. That I hate to say, but it's a form of blasphemy. It's a form of blasphemy. Taking something that is holy, his Mekra Kodesh, his holy convocations, and saying Yah hates them, so don't do them. When that's not even what the scriptures are saying. And then Barnabas goes on to say, and then he advocates there again in chapter 15, the 8th day, that is Sunday observance, over the Sabbath and the biblical feast, and writes, wherefore we also keep the 8th day which with joyfulness, the day on which Jesus rose again from the dead. So how many of you have heard the concept of the 8th day? Maybe some of you have heard that. I've heard that in the Christian church. It comes out of the Epistle of Barnabas, and then Justin Martyr quotes that too, and so do some of the others. So you have the 7th day, the 7th day Sabbath, and we know the Sunday is the first day of the week, but they view that as the 8th day. So it's the 8th day and also the first day. So because Yeshua rose on the first day, and I do believe he rose on the first day, just barely at sundown going into the first day. I do believe that, but there's no instruction to gather on that day or to honor him on that day as far as replacing the Sabbath. That's nowhere in the Bible. That's an early non-biblical Christian tradition that comes out of the Epistle of Barnabas and some other early church fathers. And the reason they talk about the 8th day is because 8 is the number of new beginnings. It's the number of infinity. The number 8 is the number of infinity. Two circles going around and around and around. And that's where the letter 8 comes from, as far as I can tell. And so they twisted this to believe that, Yeshua rose on the 8th day, and this is a picture of new life, new birth, and infinity. Okay, I don't have a problem with that analogy. I think it's actually a very good analogy. But it's not an argument for the replacement of the Sabbath. That's a lie. That was a lie that they taught the people because they didn't want to look Jewish, because they might bring the Romans down on them. Okay? And also, the pagans worshipped on the venerable day of the sun. What a great way to get the Romans off our back, not to look Jewish, and then to worship on the day that the pagans honored as the venerable day of the sun, Sunday. That's why it's called that. And bring it all together and get the pagans to start coming to our church and give them the gospel, and that they can still worship on their day that they already had off of work, and it was already acceptable in the Roman Empire. You see how when you begin to go off the rails, little by little, it becomes a slippery slope? There's an example of it. All right, let's move ahead a little bit to the next person. Justin Martyr, another early church father. He lived between 110 and 165. And he wrote a really long dissertation called Dialogue with Trypho, a Jew. So in chapter 18, he states that Yehovah commanded the Jews to be circumcised and to keep the Sabbath and biblical feasts, quote, on account of your transgressions and the hardness of your hearts, end quote. Okay. Where does the Bible ever say that he gave the Jews the Sabbath and the feast because of the hardness of their hearts? Where does it say that? No, it says, on the contrary, you did not keep them because of the hardness of your hearts. That's why you could not go into the promised land. And he says in Ezekiel 20, because I gave you the feast and you refused to keep them. Therefore, you weren't able to go into the promised land. That old generation had to die. No. Justin Martyr here, and I'm taking these early church fathers to task. Don't even waste your time reading them. Just read the Bible. You don't need them. Let me just tell you, I doubt Justin Martyr even had a Bible. These are really intelligent guys. Okay, I grant you that. But do you know how hard it was to own a Bible? How difficult they had to be all copied by hand? You either had scrolls or you had books that had to be made out of papyrus and bound together. And all copied by hand. That was very expensive. I doubt these guys even had any Bibles. They probably heard some things and they remembered them, but they weren't able to quote chapter and verse exactly, and they weren't able to quote the context. And this is what you have going on here. And yet these are the guys that set the whole standard for modern Christianity and eventually what became the Catholic Church. And then all the Orthodox churches broke off of them, and the Protestant churches broke off of them, and on and on and on it goes. And we're going to look to these guys? Give me a break. I have no use for them except to prove how they got off the rail. Now, I will admit, they have a lot of good things about the Gospels. But I don't need them. I've got the Bible. Why do I need to go there? Why do I need to read what somebody wrote about it when I can read the Bible? Not this, but this. And when they probably didn't even have a Bible, so they're false teachers on top of it all. So Trypho the Jew says, I read what he said, that the Sabbaths and the biblical feasts were given to the Israelites because of the hardness of their hearts and their sins. No, that's why he gave them the Levitical priesthood and the sacrificial system, not the biblical feast and the Sabbath. And I comment, he is ignorant of the fact that Yehovah gave Abraham circumcision as a sign of the covenant, not because of the hardness of his heart. Actually, it was a proof of, circumcision was a proof of Abraham's faithfulness and of his obedience, not the hardness of his heart. And it was a proof of Yehovah's relationship with Abraham. Circumcision was a symbol of removing the hardness of the heart, of the defilement of the flesh, not because of it. Do you get what I'm saying? Let me go over that again. Circumcision wasn't given to Abraham because of the hardness of Abraham's heart. It was a sign of his obedience, of his faith, of his faithfulness. And it was a sign that he wore on his body, like a ring, like a wedding ring. It was a sign of a relationship, a special relationship that Abraham had and succeeding Israelites would have with Elohim. And it pictured removing, I don't want to get graphic here, but when if you're a man, when you're circumcised, it speaks of removing the filth of the flesh, because the uncircumcised male member, that's a place that gets very dirty and it has to be cleansed. And removing that, and I won't get into, there's a lot of symbolism there, but it was actually a proof of having a circumcised heart. Okay? I mean, you hear the passion and the frustration in my voice. Justin Martyr has turned it upside down and reversed it, the truth of it. Shame on him. Another blasphemous statement. Moreover, the feasts are commemorative memorials of what Yehovah has done for his people, lest they forget, and also speak of present realities in the life of the saint, as well as predictive of future glorious events. They weren't given because of the hardness of people's hearts. They were given show us the steps of salvation to bring us to the Father through Yeshua the Messiah. They point to the first coming, that is the feast, the first coming of Messiah, the giving of the Holy Spirit, the second coming of Messiah, and the eventual establishment of Yehovah's eternal kingdom on the earth. Obviously, Justin Martyr is ignorant of this truth. He must not have had a Bible. If so, he hadn't read it or he didn't understand it. And yet he's one of the main early church fathers that's spewing forth this crap. I'll call it for what it is. It's garbage. It's horse manure. It's blasphemous. I'll call it for what it is. It's dung. That's the term that Paul used for all the stuff he had learned. Justin Martyr fails to understand the feasts are love feasts where Yehovah meets and communes with his people, his bride. In chapter 23 of Trypho, Justin goes on to state erroneously that Moses, not Yehovah, gave the institutions of the Sabbaths on account of sinful men. He says it again, which is why he claims that we find no mention of the Sabbath and the feast before Moses. Before Moses, quote, end quote. And this is another false statement that Genesis refutes. Genesis 1, verse 14, mentions the feasts, the Moedim, and Genesis 2, verses 1 through 3, mentions Shabbat. And then we go on to read how Abraham followed Yehovah's Torah with all of its statutes and judgments. All of it, not part of it, all of it. And that's in what, I think it's in Genesis 26. It's mentioned a couple of times. I'm not going to turn there. So again, this early church father is ignorant and a false teacher. Why should we listen to these guys? They're going off the rails into apostasy. Justin Martyr, also in his dialogue with Trypho, a Jew, in chapter 19, promotes the idea of the 8th day over the 7th day Sabbath observance. And then Justin Martyr, again in dialogue with Trypho, a Jew, chapter 47, he calls weak-mindedness those who follow the virtueless institutions of Moses, and then again declares that the Sabbath and related ceremonies, quote, were appointed by reason of the hardness of people's hearts, end quote. He then makes the false and propagandistic claim that the law was given by Moses. And he doesn't mention that it was actually given by Yehovah. How many of you have heard everybody, they talk about the law of Moses, the law of Moses, and the law of Moses? I get that. That is a biblical label. Even Yeshua uses that term in the Gospels. But the law of Moses is synonymous with the Torah. It wasn't that the law of Moses was invented by Moses, or that the Torah was invented by Moses. What makes it the law of Moses is that he is the one that wrote it down in the scroll. He heard it from Yehovah. Who is Yehovah? It's Yeshua in his pre-incarnate state. So says Yeshua the Messiah himself, and so says Stephen, and so says Paul. And we've been over those many times. The idea that the Father is the one who talked to the Israelites is a bogus lie. Yes, he talked to them, but indirectly through the word of Elohim that was made flesh. John chapter 1. The pre-incarnate Yeshua, the messenger of Yehovah, or the angel, but he's not an angel, he's a messenger. Okay? We've talked about that one. So Yeshua is Yova's divine messenger. Yovah Elohim, the Father, used Yeshua to create the word, the earth and the sun and the moon, because it says by all things they were created by him. Paul says that in Colossians 1 or 2 and several other places. John says that as well. And so the Father used the Son to create everything, to create humans, and then to enter into a relationship with human beings and eventually come to the earth as the Son of Elohim, as Elohim incarnate. So Justin doesn't even get this right. Okay, what about Passover? Ignatius was a pupil of John and a co-disciple with Polycarp, and I don't know what that means. What does it mean to be a disciple? I don't know. Did he meet him once? Oh, now I'm a disciple? Did he exchange a couple letters? Or did he actually sit at John's feet? I don't know. We don't know. But Polycarp, in the martyrdom of, but Ignatius, in the martyrdom of Ignatius, chapter 3, wait, I've got a misquote here. I got to check it. It's either in, I have to go back and check. Either in the, I think it's it's either the martyrdom of Ignatius, chapter 3, or the epistle of Ignatius to the Philadelphians, chapter 14. I'll have to go back and check that reference. It's one of the two. I did a copy and paste. He says there, if anyone celebrates the Passover along with the Jews or receives the emblems of their feast, he is a partaker of those that killed the Lord and his apostles. So my comment is, that's a direct quote. It is unclear here if Ignatius is merely against the Jewish Passover or against Passover itself or both. He doesn't really state it. I tend to think he's probably against Passover and a Jewish Passover because he doesn't qualify his statement and say, I'm against all the non-biblical Jewish traditions and all the stuff that the Jews do, with their Passover. He doesn't make that statement. He comes out against it just generally. Interestingly, the book of fellowship, and he talks about, he condemns those who hang out with the Jews. Well, interestingly, the book of Acts records that the early believers still frequented the temple and the synagogues wherever they went. Paul did. You read the book of Acts. And thus fellowship with those that killed the Lord and his apostles. I mean, Paul went to the temple for, to get out of his Nazirite vow, to offer up sacrifices. And they regularly worshiped and prayed in the temple. And they fellowshiped with the Jews in the synagogue until finally the Jews kicked them out. And that's a matter of history. By the Birkat HaMinim, the curse. There were so many Christians that were attending Shabbat services. I mean, isn't that what Paul says? Or not Paul, but James and the Jerusalem Council. Go to the synagogue in Acts 15. Go to the synagogue every week where Moses is taught. I guess Justin Martyr never read the book of Acts. There again, I don't even think he had a Bible. He's propagating this anti-Jewish, anti-Hebraic trope. If he had a Bible, he didn't know it very well, and he probably didn't even read it. Or maybe he read it once, and now he's an expert. I don't know. So he was against the Passover. Here's the observance. Now let's go to the next point. Observance of the Lord's Day or Sunday advocated over Sabbath observance. Back to Ignatius, the pupil of John, who lived from AD 30 to 107. In his epistle, the epistle of Ignatius to the Magnesians, chapter 9, the author, that's Ignatius, says to keep both the Sabbath on Sunday, but prefers Sunday over the Sabbath, demoting the former while elevating the latter. He writes, quote, but let every one of you keep the Sabbath after a spiritual manner, rejoicing in meditation on the law, not in relaxation of the body, admiring the workmanship of God, and not eating things prepared the day before. In other words, you're going to spend all day eating ordinary, unexciting food, whatever you happen to have on hand. Don't prepare it as a feast. Read your Bible all day and sit there and meditate and do not rest. He's going against the very things that you're supposed to be doing on the Sabbath. You're supposed to prepare wonderful meals, get it all prepared, eat good food, rejoice. It's a feast day. Go read Leviticus. It's a Mikra Kodesh. Go read Leviticus 23, verse 2 or 3. It's a feast day, not a fast day. It's a day to rest. That's what the word Shabbat means. So here we see, if you go back and read in early church history, you see that some of these early church fathers, they couldn't really toss Shabbat under the bus because there were so many Christians that followed it. So they turned it into a fast day, into a day of drudgery and monotony. And then they turned the first day of the week into a day of celebration and feasting. And in so doing, they turned people's hearts away from the seventh-day Sabbath. But it was still too hard for many people to let go of it, even by the time of the seventh-day Sabbath, even by the time of the Council of Nicaea. So a couple hundred years later, there were still so many people, according to some historical accounts, half the churches in the Roman Empire were still doing the Sabbath, and some were doing both, the Sabbath and Sunday, that Constantine, you can go read Eusebius, his ecclesiastical history book, which I have up there, and Constantine had to force the Sabbath at the point of the sword upon the bishops that were gathered at the Council of Nicaea there in Asia Minor. Because he did not want people doing this Jewish stuff, and he wanted the empire to be unified on the venerable day of the sun. And so he did that for political expediency purposes. So there again, the church, you don't hear this in your Sunday churches, folks. You don't hear this, in any of the mainstream church, but here it is, black and white. This is what they taught. Therefore, Sabbath is an arduous and drudgery fast, not a joyous feast. And then he goes on to say, nor drink lukewarm drinks, walking within a prescribed space. He says, use only lukewarm drinks, walk within a prescribed space, and do not find delight in dancing or plaudits with which have no sense in them. In other words, you don't rejoice. It's not an enjoyable day. And after the observance of the Sabbath, let every friend of Christ keep the Lord's Day as a festival, the resurrection day, the queen and chief of the days of the week. That he's talking about Sunday. Sabbath is not the most important day. It's not the chief of the day. It is Sunday, the eighth day, the day of the resurrection. That's what we want to get you guys to do, and not this other thing. Again, that's his epistle of Ignatius to the Magnesians, chapter 9. Barnabas, here's another one from Barnabas, the Alexandrian Jew. In the epistle of Barnabas, chapter 15, about Jehovah's feast, Barnabas advocates the eighth day, Sunday observance over the Sabbath and the biblical feast, and writes, wherefore we also keep the eighth day with joyfulness, the day on which Jesus rose again from the dead. So no mention of the seventh-day Sabbath. Now, here's some teachings, quotes from them with regard to teachings against the Torah. Ignatius, in his epistle of Ignatius to the Philadelphians, chapter 6, the author declares, quote, if anyone preach the Jewish law or Judaism, listen not to him. So again, he could be referring to, it's unclear here, is he referring to the Jewish religion or the Jewish law? I guess the Greek here could go either way. And so, again, he's not clear. But it would appear that he's not making any caveats as to say, okay, do not follow the traditions of men by which the word of God is not in effect, but follow the law of Elohim in the Bible. He's not saying that. He's just saying, don't do what they do. Don't follow their religion. Don't follow their laws. As if the Torah came from Jehovah. And then in his epistle to the Magnesians, chapter 8, he says, old things are passed away. Behold, all things have become new. For if we still live according to the Jewish law and the circumcision of the flesh, we deny that we have received grace. End quote. How many of you have heard that if you go back and follow the law, you are no longer under grace? How many of you have heard that? You have fallen from grace. Where do you think they got it from? This is what these guys were teaching. And this was a twisting of Galatians and Acts 15, among other things. The issue in Galatians was not whether the law is valid or not, the Torah. It's about, is circumcision a requirement for salvation? And this is what these guys do not understand. And this is what this same lie, it says that Galatians was about the Torah, the validity of Torah or not. This whole, and Colossians chapter 2 and Hebrews chapter 8 and in some of these other places. Romans chapter 7. I mean, we could go on and on, where they take these things and they twist them around to make it not the issue and make it a completely different issue that it is not. And then brainwash people into believing the lie that they're teaching. Again, the issue is not whether in any of these arguments that the apostles were making, it wasn't about the validity of Torah. It was about, are you saved by your works? By circumcision or by the works of the law? No, that we're not saved. We're saved by grace through faith unto good works. And our good works determine our rewards in the kingdom. And the fruit of the Spirit is proof that we are doing good works and that we're staying on the rails of the train track to keep us going in the right direction. So he got that one all mixed up. And then in back to Justin Martyr, in the first apology of Justin Martyr, chapter 47, the author states that out of weak-mindedness, that's a quote, some Christians observe the Mosaic law, and Sabbath and feast days observance is optional but not encouraged. Goes on and on. Here's some anti-Semitic or anti-Torah theology. Barnabas, in his epistle of Barnabas, chapter 3, he states that the Israelites or the Jews lost the covenant when they turned to worshiping the golden calf. Another lie. Did Yehovah break the covenant with them at the golden calf? No. Thanks to Moses, Moses interceded in chapter 32 for the people. Y'all wanted to destroy them. But Moses, as the great high priest, interceded for them. And we have listed in Exodus 32 the 13 attributes of Yehovah's mercy and grace. And he says, okay, I will not destroy them. I will maintain my relationship with them in spite of what they have done. That's clear. And yet, Barnabas totally gets that one all mixed up and turns the truth into a lie. Barnabas also, in his epistle to Barnabas, chapter 16, he refers to the Jews as wretched. Wretched. These guys are doing everything they can to turn people away from the Jews, away from the Torah, away from the law, away from the covenants, away from anything Hebraic. And that has been codified into Christian theology for the last better part of 2,000 years. And dear brothers and sisters, that's what you are up against when you are trying to share your faith, your Torah Hebraic faith, with your brothers and sisters out there in the Christian world. These things have been so set in concrete and then pushed into people's minds and cemented there and written in stone. That's what you are up against. Unless Yehovah is opening up people's hearts and minds and causing them to hunger and thirst, and which you are those kind of people, and Yah is calling people. But the vast majority are still asleep, believing these lies. Ignatius, in his epistle of Ignatius to the Magnesians, chapter 10, he writes, "It is absurd to speak of Jesus Christ with the tongue and to cherish in the mind a Judaism which has now come to an end. For where there is Christianity, there cannot be Judaism." He doesn't go on to qualify. Do not follow the Jews in their anti-Messiah rhetoric. He doesn't say that. He doesn't say do not follow the Jewish traditions by which the word of Elohim has been made of none effect. He does not say that. Do not follow the oral Torah. He doesn't say that. But follow the Jews if they do what's right, if it lines up with the Bible. He doesn't say that. He just says, reject everything. That tends to be the general consensus of the early church fathers, at least the earliest ones that I'm reading and quoting from. And it only gets worse. We haven't even got to Irenaeus and others that came later. Well, Irenaeus, who lived circa 180 AD, in his book Against Heresies, book 4, chapter 16, subsection 4, the author declares that the Decalogue was not canceled by the New Covenant, but the statutes and judgments of the Torah were a bondage to the Israelites and are no longer binding on Christians. That's Irenaeus, another one of the big name church fathers. And then Ignatius, in his epistle of Ignatius to the Philadelphians, chapter 6, here the author states, quote, "But if anyone preach the Jewish law unto you, listen not to him. If anyone confesses the truths mentioned or deems certain kinds of food abominable, such a one has the apostate dragon dwelling within him." So if you advocate the dietary laws, you have the apostate dragon living in him. Yehovah is the one that gave the dietary laws. He's the one that said it's abominable to eat these things. He calls it an abomination. He's the one that says if you follow the dietary laws, you will be holy as I am holy. He's calling the people to holiness. Ignatius, the one who's advocating these things and calling Yehovah and the teachings of Yehovah, the apostate dragon dwelling within him, and more blasphemy, at least in this regard, Ignatius is the one that has the apostate dragon dwelling within him. I could go on and on. I'm not going to stop there. I have a bunch of teachings about the immortality of the soul. I have a whole bunch of things here where these guys take in the false pagan concept of the immortality of the soul, and they take in the Greek philosophies of the Greek philosophers. I could talk about how Easter came into Christianity around circa AD 150. How Sabbath was changed, more on that from early church historians. How Christmas was established finally as a Christian holiday in 354 AD. I think that was after Constantine's death. I think it was actually put into place by his son. And I haven't even gotten into Marcion of Sinope. I've got a couple pages of notes just on him, the heretic that lived during the middle part of the 2nd century. But that gives you kind of an idea. Again, I hope maybe proves my idea, my point, that the feast days and the Sabbath and the dietary laws are the things that keep us on the trail and on the rail that leads to Yeshua. They're not the only thing, but they're some of the main things. That if we do those things, we will stay in the river of life. We will stay, as long as we keep Yeshua at the center of it and the message of the gospel, which this ministry does, and we do to the best of our ability. I mean, Yeshua is every other word in this ministry, pretty much. And this will keep you on the track. And if you get off the track, you start to go off into all kinds of weird stuff, which I've just proven that the early church fathers did very, very shortly after the death of the last apostle. And it just kept going and going, getting worse and worse and worse, till now this is what we're dealing with almost 2,000 years later. And the way that the early church fathers left the truth, and the main things that they left the truth in, the dietary laws, the feasts, and the Sabbath, those are the first things that people are coming back to get back on the track. And once they get back to that, then he can begin to reveal more truth to them. And I think a lot of you can look in your own lives and see this is what this is how you came back. And since you've come back to these basic fundamentals of holiness and righteousness, that Yehovah has revealed more and more truth to you, has deepened your understanding of the scriptures, has brought you closer to Yeshua, has your life has cleaned up, your life has gotten better. At least maybe you've been persecuted more, but at least some people's marriages have been healed. Other people's marriages have been split apart because their spouses didn't want to go along with this. For many people, when you started eating kosher, biblically kosher, your diet cleaned up, your health improved. You started reading labels. You started, on and on. A lot of good things started to happen. And we've had testimonies and made videos on that. So, and it's not a bondage. It's a blessing. It's eye-opening and enlightening, and it opens up the Bible in ways that you've never heard before, and you can hear his voice better and walk in line with him. As long as you're walking in love and in the spirit, not just in dead letter of the law legalism. And I want to make that caveat. Been there, done that. That's another off in the ditch kind of a situation. So anyway, I hope this blessed somebody. I hope this was enlightening. And yes, hallelujah. There's some more truth, unvarnished truth, that I hope that you can use some of this information as you go forth to share the good news and the truth with your friends and those around you that have a heart to want to know the truth, the whole truth and nothing but the truth. So help us, Elohim. Amen.